Let's see if it works. Create live. There. Are we live? Is it working? Hey! Internet. Welcome back, Internet. Alright. Yeah, so this is what I was going to go over for you online folks. Why is it not showing up on the YouTube portion? Alright, let me just go ahead and bring this down entirely. Okay. Bless you. There we go. Okay. So again, I've put this up on Blackboard for everybody, but I just want to go over it for you online folks. This isn't new for another month, but default topic, compare and contrast the way the European powers dealt with the natives. So that's mainly Spain, France, and England. The paper is, or the book is typically going to be enough for that. You're recommended to use outside sources, but you don't have to. Use MLA formatting for citation. I strongly suggest you cite your sources because that's kind of necessary. If you want to do stuff that's not that topic, you're more than welcome to. In fact, I kind of suggest that you do because I'm teaching this class basically 4 times. I can't count. And I'm going to be getting a lot of this paper. So if you want to do something besides this paper, that'd be great. Anything early American history from the start of the book, so, you know, Stone Age stuff, to basically the American Revolution. You need to stop at the American Revolution because the next paper is on the American Revolution. That's not due until the end of the semester, so don't worry about that right now. But yeah, 2 to 3 pages, double spaced. It's not that big. So if you do want to do something besides the default topic, just like ask me, or for this case of you online folks, just send me an email and let me know what you're thinking about. So it's not something that's too broad. I mentioned it down here. We don't need a biography for like these real important people because that's going to be way too broad for a 2 to 3 page paper. So keep it a little bit more concise than that. Obviously, for you online people, you can just email it to me. For you people here in class, I'd prefer that you bring it in physically. If you need to email it to me, that's also fine. But other than that, that's all I got for this. Any questions from you guys in here that can interact with me directly? Cool. So for the like 60 of you online, sorry. Okay. You guys can just email me as you need to. Yeah, nobody's watching right now, which I don't blame them. I wouldn't be up at 8 in the morning if I didn't have to be. Okay. So let's bring this back down and get started with the notes again. Boop, 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 boop. This is where we finished. So we talked about the trade moving from not just tobacco, but also into sugarcane in the Caribbean, which, as we also mentioned, you use sugarcane for molasses and then rum. But one of the most important parts of this was that the Dutch partnered with the English to make this work. The English had the land for it, in particular Barbados. Where are we at? Up here. And the Dutch, while they didn't necessarily have enough land to really create the plantations for it, they did have the refineries to make the finished product. So they worked with the English to get the sugar and refine it and everything. And this really changed the economic landscape of the whole region, not just the Caribbean, but also North America, as we're going to see going forward. And this goes not just North America, but also even South America, down in Brazil. They used the same amount of chattel slavery as they did in the Caribbean, not just for sugarcane, but also for the silver mines they had there, because apparently mining silver also worked people to death. So, you know, that's how they did it. So a lot of that, had a lot of images for this, which I found pretty interesting. It took a lot to properly refine sugar into a usable state. And then that final comment I had where South Carolina wasn't actually a colony of England per se, but of Barbados, which Barbados was an English colony. It's not to say that we were from some other country, but Barbados actually sent like people up into the southern part of the colonies and found land that was very much like the islands down here and started using it. So, with that done, let's get into the final section of the book. We should be able to finish this today. So, while the homeland, the mother countries, so to speak, were making their money down in the Caribbean, the Virginia colony was still looking for more ways to make money because, tobacco prices were stagnating, which didn't mean they weren't making money off of tobacco. They just weren't making all the money off tobacco. So they started selling legal charters to anybody that could buy them. So, you can pay money to set up your own little colony from land that was taken from the natives. Like real estate today. Selling people land that doesn't belong to them. So a bunch of English pilgrims purchased one of these charters, for a variety of reasons. First off, let me explain to you folks what a pilgrim actually is. It's an old English term, an old medieval term, I should say, that simply means like a religious traveler. If you've ever had to read the Canterbury Tales for your literature class, those were pilgrims. They were going on a pilgrimage, on a religious journey to the cathedral in Canterbury, because that was considered like a holy site where the Archbishop of Canterbury was murdered, or martyred, I suppose would be the correct word. So this wasn't just a group of weirdos that had the name pilgrims. They saw themselves as people who were going on a religious journey, in particular away from the Catholics, Anglicans, and just Europe in general, because it was seen as not being holy enough. Now, I should mention that they were known as separatists because they wished to separate themselves from Europe and the various religious goings-on there, which is going to be different from another group we're going to talk about here in just a little bit. So they left from Plymouth, England, in the Mayflower, which is not a big ship. I've got an image of it, and just using scaling, you can see how small that ship was. They had English and Dutch pilgrims. This is something you may have learned in high school. I distinctly remember this. Granted, my schooling was a little bit weird, but like the English pilgrims were like, oh, we can't be around these Dutch. They're like infecting our English children. It's like, you're all the same religion. They're just speaking a different language. Y'all were weird. Anyway, turns out the Atlantic wasn't too kind to them and ended up pushing them way off course. They were going to try to land like near Jamestown. They ended up in what is now Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in December. If you've ever been anywhere near Massachusetts in December, you know that's not a great place to be. So it was getting cold, and they decided that they probably didn't have the supplies to try to sail south. So they disembarked and decided to make good with what they could. Before leaving, though, under William Bradford, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was the first written constitution in North America, basically because they were beyond the legal limitations of where they were supposed to be, and they wanted to ensure that they all had agreed to follow some form of legal charter. Because essentially they were squatters. They had ended up where they weren't supposed to be. They found an uninhabited village with cornfields, which was good for them because they immediately had a source of food. They named their new home Plymouth, which, if you recall, is the same place they left from. Oops, I don't know why I did that. Yeah, same place they left from. And when they spotted some natives in the area, they quickly built a fort, which I've got a basic plan of what that fort looked like. The natives, though, were in no shape to try to fight off these newcomers. They had dealt with smallpox 2 years prior and were about 10% of their original numbers. Still, though, as we've seen in the past, Europeans aren't very good at surviving in North America over the course of a winter. So by the following spring, the Pilgrims were down to about half of their original number. That said, that's still a whole lot better than the numbers in Jamestown. Like the numbers in Jamestown were always like 70 to 80% death rate. So like losing half the population was an improvement. Anyway, here's the Mayflower. Now at first it's like, yeah, it's a nice sized sailing ship. But then you see the rowboat next to it, and the guy's standing on top. It's like barely a 2-story building. And even that, the upper part is just the captain's cabin, and the rest of it is down here. I'm like, yeah, it sits a little bit low in the water, but there's not going to be a lot of room down there. So it's mostly just like, I would say probably less room than what's in this room below decks. And then also, yeah. And there's this nice image of the folks signing the Mayflower Compact looking like they're in some crowded attic. Because, again, not a whole lot of room in this place. We also have the fort here that they built. And since they weren't in a swamp like Jamestown, they didn't have to worry about the mosquitoes killing them. All right. More on the Pilgrims. So that following spring, two English-speaking natives approached them, Samoset and Squanto, who managed a rather shaky peace with the chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe. So, like with Jamestown, the natives came in and were like, hey, you guys look like you're having a hard time. We notice most of you are no longer here. Now, much like Powhatan down in Jamestown, Massasoit knew what the Europeans were about, and seeing the Pilgrims in a bad place, wanted to use their power against his tribal rivals, and in return, basically help them survive. Return for seeds, fishing gear, etc. So it's like, hey, you give us stuff to help us fight our rivals, and we'll give you stuff to help you not die. Seems like a pretty nice deal, don't you think? By the summer, though, the Pilgrims were in better shape. More supplies had shown up, and a charter came the next year that made Plymouth Plantation legitimate. So now they could actually self-govern without worrying about, like, royal authority rolling in and telling them they needed to get the hell out of there. So hey, Plymouth Plantation's a legitimate little spot now. Also, despite it not being great during the winter, and I can speak from experience, I was in Rhode Island for 2 years for grad school. Being in that area during the winter ain't great, but it did reduce the amount of disease, as I had said, compared to the mosquito-infested swamps of Jamestown. So it made the colony far less likely to fall apart from everybody dying. Yeah, I didn't notice a whole lot of mosquitoes up there. Then you come down here, and it's like the air is either water from the humidity or mosquitoes. So the Pilgrims, once they regained their strength and started growing in number, did become more aggressive against the natives, but unlike the folks in Jamestown, they became more aggressive against the natives who opposed them. They didn't immediately start murdering the natives who had been helping them. So one particular tribe that opposed the Pilgrims being there was the Massachusetts tribe. Miles Standish, a particularly militaristic pilgrim, led an attack against Massachusetts village, kidnapped and killed the chief and his brother. Excuse me. Ooh. The tribes scattered and fled north and west, and thus more tribes were alerted to the presence of the Pilgrims and their rather aggressive leader. Now, the Dutch separatists weren't too happy about just wiping out natives. They preferred to try to convert them to Christianity. But this strategy did mean that the tribes that were friendly with the Pilgrims would quickly become the most powerful in the region because, well, they were the only ones left. So here we have Ciudad San Squanto. Here's Plymouth as it received its charter. We still have Governor Bradford here. So he's still in charge. There's the boys going out to have a chat with the Massachusetts tribe. There they are having a chat with the Massachusetts tribe. That's Miles Standish right there in the middle. Now, this scattering the Massachusetts tribe is actually going to continue to resonate into some later events. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Because there's another group in this region we're going to need to talk about. If you're familiar at all with the really basic American history, you should know what we're talking about. And that's the Puritans. So, yay, it's a touch screen. I can't even get the spots off the screen without messing it up. Right. So, the Puritans decided they wanted to develop their own settlement as well. They were facing persecution in England, but that wasn't the only reason they wanted to head across the Atlantic. So the Puritans had a very specific mindset, and in fact this is going to inform a lot of what's going forward well into later chapters. So any disasters, either natural or man-made, including economic disasters or punishments brought about by God, and anything going on in England that was seen as negative was God being angry, I guess. Actually, I hope to hell my testing. Okay. I didn't check if my mic was working. It should have been, but you never know. Okay. So they saw New England as a haven from God's wrath. and also a place to build a pure and just society away from England's corruption. But unlike the Pilgrims, or the Separatists, as again they were also called, the Puritans wished to build a city upon a hill to inspire the purification of Anglicanism. So, once again, it's in the name. The Pilgrims / Separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England. The Puritans wanted to create a more pure and just society to purify or reform the Church of England. They wanted the Church of England to be changed into some better form. So they weren't leaving the Church of England to be rid of it. They were leaving the Church of England to show them how they could be better, essentially. And they felt like they could make a change happen in England. So this group was easily the best equipped group of English settlers by far. They arrived north of Plymouth in 1630, 17 ships, entire families, ministers, merchants, craftsmen, farmers. The book goes into greater details, like blacksmiths, just everything they needed to set up a town just immediately. They also had maps of the coastline to decide where they were going to settle, not just, well, this looks good, let's land here. And they settled in a town they would name, or in what would eventually be a town. They would name Boston, which was named after the port from which they left, because, I don't know, it's weird. Do you think if they're coming across the Atlantic Ocean to make a new start, they name the city that they were creating something else besides where they had left from? I don't know, that's just me. Like, at least down in Maryland, they named it like St. Mary's City, which was certainly not the name of the place they'd left from. Also, something different about the Puritans. They moved the capital and records for the Massachusetts Bay Company to New England, which, again, New England was the name of the colony, not just the region that we now think of as the Northeast, and set the commercial charter up as the founding document for the colony. So rather than, what this all means, for like Jamestown, Virginia, etc., and Maryland later, all of their paperwork and whatnot was back in England. It was in some office building somewhere, or like in a vault in a bank. And so they were tied back to England. The Puritans wanted everything to be in their colony. So like the official founding document was their charter, and it was in their colony. Like, they were as independent as you could be back then. They were still an English colony, and they did still, follow the decisions of England. But, like, they were as on their own as you could be. And not just the records, but also, with everything else, as with their supplies and the people and stuff. They also established a polity where all adult males could vote, had a governor, John Winthrop, a Puritan lawyer, deputy governor, and a legislature, which again, that it took a while for Virginia to ever have its House of Burgesses, and that was like something that was granted to them by England. Um, Here they had it all planned out from the start. The Puritans did still have a rough first winter because I mean they're in freaking Boston, um, but very quickly they had things up and running, and by the 1630, By the 1630s, thousands of immigrants were pouring into uh, Massachusetts Bay Colony / New England. It was kind of the same. It was the same colony. And as we're going to see here in just a little bit, they quickly evolved beyond just Boston. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, we all know what the Puritans look like with their little hats and whatnot. I don't know. Nice. I don't know who this little cherub fellow is up here. There they are landing, bringing their stuff ashore. Got a guy back here that's he's just destroying his bag. Also, something we're going to see in art for a while is the inability for artists to correctly do child proportions. This is just an adult human man shrunk down. Like, look how large his, like, look at the size of his head and arms compared to his body. Like, that's just a man made smaller. Like, that's not a child. Anyway, this is the region we'll actually, I don't know if we'll actually talk about Connecticut. Connecticut's not super important. We'll talk about Rhode Island here in a little bit. But yeah, there's Plymouth. There's a good little bay there. And then further up was Boston, and they eventually had like all of this Massachusetts Bay Colony. This will come later. But yeah, it was a good little spot, relatively speaking. I mean, cold, but better than mosquitoes, I guess. I mean, we were there in August, and the high was like 74, and the humidity was like 60%. And one of the guys there was like, "Oh, sorry, it's so hot today." It's like, what are you talking about? Do you not know where we're from? This is like winter weather. So, as I said, this rapid growth did mean that they couldn't maintain a single city, so they had to quickly develop policies on how to establish more towns. The legislature was called the General Court, and so they, set laws on how to establish new towns. Every town had to have a local church, a local school, and other important things. Whenever I see stuff like that, it reminds me of when I was in Ireland, and we'd be riding through towns on the bus, and every town you could count it. There'd be a church, a pub, and a bookmaker, usually in that order, usually on the same street. And if you're not familiar with what a bookmaker is, because I didn't know that, that's a term I didn't recognize. That's where you go in and place bets on whatever. And I remember that year I was there, actually, there was a new pope. I don't know if this was when the old one died or if this is when Benedict stepped down. But and they were like placing money bets on who the new pope was going to be. Like, the Irish like gambling. So Massachusetts Bay Colony didn't have the climate for tobacco or sugarcane, but right off the coast were huge shoals of codfish. They had plenty of trees for lumber and decent enough climate for other crops, wheat, rye, oats, and then land for pigs and cows, pork and cheese. And then they would send that stuff off to England for manufactured goods, cloth, iron pots, etc. And then also down to the West Indies for rum and molasses, because that's what you want to get from the West Indies. And as we're going to see a little bit later, once the colonies do start developing, there does kind of become this internal trade within the colonies, within North America, the northern part of North America, the southern part of North America, and then the Caribbean. Because England's always busy with some war or other, and the colonies are often left alone to do their own thing, as actually we're going to see here in just a few slides. And once the colonies are strong and independent enough, they just kind of can do what they want until England comes back. It's like, oh, hey guys, just remember us. So they were relatively friendly with the Massachusetts natives. Remember those guys? Well, now they're up where the Puritans are, and apparently they didn't just consider all English settlers the same. So the Puritans were actually getting along okay with the Massachusetts, who had been nearly wiped out by Miles Standish and his lads back in 1623. So Puritan missionaries taught their students how to read the Bible. Some went to the Harvard College, which was established in 1636. Most of the colleges, and by most I mean pretty much all the colleges at the start, were seminaries. It's where you went to learn how to be a missionary or a preacher. And this included even like the Native Americans who converted to Christianity and learned how to read the Bible. Some of them were even like permitted to go to college to be a missionary, I guess. John Eliot created praying towns. Christian natives could live alongside the English to try to wean them off of their traditional customs and beliefs and keep other settlers from exploiting them, because, English settlers doing as they do. But much like with the Pueblo we talked about before, most Native Americans, and again, you can't really paint this group as a single thing, but it seems like across the board, most Native American groups were pretty content with just like, hey, sure, we'll add your God to the pile, and the Christians were like, no, you can't do that. It's like, why not? We've done this forever. We're agreeing that we can pray to your God, but why are you trying to take away all our other ones? We've done this forever. What is that? Oh, I don't want that. Appreciate that I get an email telling me that my video is live. Alright. So, here's the Puritans making friends with the natives. already lost his name. John Eliot. Okay. Right. Time to get into what's going to be important for the next several chapters. And that is what the Puritans were about. So as we said, they saw any outward signs, any kind of events going on in the world as God's punishment or blessings on people or even whole countries, and they were firm believers in Calvinism, which is to say predestination. It's weird that this idea that like natural events, fires or storms or whatever, being God's wrath came from Calvinism, and like you can still see it in the modern day with some religious groups, but they tend not to be Calvinist. It's like, so you believe in predestination? Oh, no, absolutely not. But also, you know, got to get after them people God's mad at. But what about when the tornado destroyed your church? Oh, no, that so totally was a fluke. And again, just to reiterate, Calvinism was this belief that that people who would go to heaven was decided from the start of creation. When God created everything, you were on the list. Either you're going to heaven or hell, and no good works would change that. But if you were going to go to heaven, you'd be benevolent, virtuous, and above all, successful. So you'd just be playing your part in this grand theater. And again, any events were at the time were seen as God's hand in the world, eclipses and comets to deform births, which we will get into in greater detail when we talk about witchcraft. How far do we go until? How far until we get to the Salem witch trials? Oh, okay, it's chapter 4. Yeah, okay. Chapter 4 is Salem witch trials. They mention a remarkable providence. In fact, I'll read you from the book what they said. I mean, the basic information's here, but when a smallpox epidemic killed several thousand Massachusetts natives in 1633 to 34, a Puritan town council observed, "Without this remarkable and terrible stroke of God upon the native, we would with much more difficulty have found room and at far greater charge have obtained and purchased land." And then the book says, clearly God was shining his light on the Puritans rather than on the Massachusetts. So, yeah, this group of natives who we've been trying to convert and, bring to God's light, which again is weird for a Calvinist group of people. But anyway, it's like, oh yeah, God wiped them out with a deadly plague. Cool, we can now get the land for cheaper. All right. The leaders are typically devout Puritans, like with Winthrop, or even ministers themselves, and tended to run the government as Puritans first and government leaders second. There was no separation of church and state, that's for sure, which, there wasn't in England anyway. The church was part of the government. It was a branch of the government, essentially. That was normal. So if you were an adherent Puritan, it was just how things worked. the government was run by Puritans, and if you were a Puritan, it was just another day. Um, However, if you had some dissent with the way the Puritans did things, you were not just disagreeing with the church, you were disagreeing with the government and the entire community. And that's the next slide, so we'll get there in just a second. However, before we do that, I have one of my favorite, I guess this is I said this was a broadside yesterday. I think that's what this is. This is a thing they like post up in the middle of town, so when you can see it when you're walking by, and obviously the big words first, and you walk up and read it. Heaven's alarm to the world, or a sermon where is shewed the fearful sights and signs in heaven, where are blah 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 presages of the great calamities at hand, etc., etc. My favorite part of this is the name of the fellow who is presenting this. His name is Increase Mather. First name Increase. The father of someone who's actually going to be very important when we get to the witch trials, Cotton Mather. The Puritans had some interesting names. So, yeah. Anyway, Increase. Anyway. So, some people did disagree with the Puritan authority. And the first one on this list was a fellow named Roger Williams. He was a minister in Salem, and he believed that the Puritan leaders weren't Puritan enough. They had not rejected enough of the Church of England. A number of the Puritan leaders were not saints, and again, to use the Puritan vocabulary here, if you were destined for heaven, you were automatically considered a saint. It's not the Catholic version of saints. So he believed that a number of the leaders were not pure enough and therefore were going to hell because they weren't showing enough outward signs of God's chosenness or whatever. Needless to say, they weren't too happy with this and kicked him out of Massachusetts, or Massachusetts Bay Colony. So some folks followed him, and he went south and founded Providence, because Providence is a real good, scriptural term, and wasn't the name of the town he had left from, so that's already a point in his favor. And this would eventually become the colony of Rhode Island. I went to grad school in Providence. Actually, the college I went to, Providence College, it's still a seminary. They still train friars there. It's a Catholic Dominican seminary. One of my professors was a Dominican friar. So not quite a Roger Williams, which there's definitely a Roger. Actually, yeah, Providence, Rhode Island is like every 2 blocks there's a college. There are so many colleges. I walked past like 3 just to get to Providence, and I lived maybe 5 miles from Providence College. It was ridiculous. Anyway, so despite Roger Williams being like, you Puritans aren't Puritan enough, I'm going to go and make my own colony, um, he taught that we should accept those who would not be saved, and therefore accepted Quakers, Baptists, and Jews into the community, and also insisted on a separation of church and state. So unlike Boston, where the church essentially ran the state, the guy who told the Puritans they weren't Puritan enough was actually like more secular, at least in the way he ran his colony. So that was interesting. Worked closely with the Narragansett natives, trading and peaceful land transfer. Yeah, I've not found much to speak ill of with Roger Williams. So yeah, Roger Williams, interesting dude. You think when he's like, "Hey, you guys who are real strict and weird about stuff, you're not strict and weird enough." And then he goes and does his own thing. It's going to be like a cult compound, and it's going to end up getting burned down by the government. Waco. But no, it's just like he went the opposite direction. The next year, Rhode Island got some more members in the form of Anne Hutchinson and her followers. However, Anne Hutchinson, who had done basically the same thing Roger Williams did, got a very different outcome. So she was put on trial in 1637 for sedition. So let's go into detail as to what that was. So sedition, being that she was trying to overthrow the government, was because she challenged the colonial leaders, and thus the devout Puritans, because they're all the same thing. But it wasn't that she told them they weren't Puritan enough, or that she was trying to lead some violent mob into the Boston courthouse or something. She said that she had an immediate revelation from God. Does the book go into detail about that? Immediate revelation from God, the voice of his spirit, his own spirit to my soul. Since Puritans believed that God spoke only through the intermediary of properly appointed male ministers, her claim was condemned as heretical. And, a lot of churches even today are still like, oh, only men can be ministers or pastors or whatever the term is. I mean, even in the last couple of decades, the Methodist Church had a huge split over, like, allowing women to preach. Like, it's still a big thing in some denominations. So her whole thing, she was a threat not just because of her religious beliefs, but because she was also a woman. Her accusations were rooted in both her challenge of gender hierarchy and her challenge to Puritan authority, which, according to Puritan authority, was the same thing. In fact, here we are in the book. The Reverend Hugh Peter, for example, reprimanded her at her trial. You have stepped out of your place and have rather been a husband than a wife, and a preacher than a hearer, and a magistrate than a subject. Thus the accusations against her are rooted. Yeah, I just read that. Okay. So yeah, the whole issue was that she had said she heard from God, and because she was a she, it was a big deal. Like if some dude was like, I heard the voice of God, they'd be like, okay, cool. So there's Roger Williams working with the natives. There's Providence, Rhode Island. Pretty decent shot. There's Ann Hutchinson looking defiant. Here's Ann Hutchinson making a free throw. I don't know why that's going on, but I decided to include it. And here she is being marched out of Massachusetts Bay Colony under heavy guard, because you never know what someone who said she heard God's voice might do. She might be dangerous. So that's those who disagree with the Puritans were doing. All right, let's knock out the last bit and we can be done with the chapter. So we can get on to chapter 3. Today's Wednesday. Next week. I don't know what day it is. Okay. So there's a large and powerful tribe in the region known as the Pequot tribe. Puritans and Pilgrims both were concerned about their strength. 2 Englishmen were found dead in 1636, and they used it as justification to attack said tribe. They allied with the Narragansetts, which was one of the groups that Roger Williams had befriended, and eventually defeated them by 1637. And let's see, months of bloody conflict, the English and their native allies launched a brutal attack on the Pequot fort, left some 400 men, women, and children dead. The English saw the victory as a sign of God's grace, and the Narragansetts saw it as the defeat of a powerful rival. But this is the first of many conflicts in this last bit of the chapter. Over in England, there's a lot happening. It would take almost an entire class to get into, but middle, Parliament and King Charles are being sassy back and forth. Eventually there's a civil war. Parliament wins, being led by absolutely not. Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan. Since they won, and Oliver Cromwell was a military dictator, they changed the Church of England to be less Catholic, because as we'd seen, the Church of England was basically Catholicism, but with the king instead of the Pope. So essentially Puritanism was like the religion in England for a few years. There was a lot of weird stuff happening in England while Cromwell was in charge. Also, he did a lot of genocide in Ireland while he was in charge. In fact, if you're in Ireland and you say Oliver Cromwell, you're supposed to spit on the floor. And then when he died, his son was supposed to take over, but his son was garbage, so they kicked him out and brought back Charles's son, Charles II, who had retreated to France because he thought he was going to be murdered. They're like, hey, so we murdered your dad, but you can be on the throne now. And Puritans had to go to North America if they wanted to have their own little republic. The point of all that is there was a lot going on where England was preoccupied. So Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and this region that was just called New England, that would eventually be Maine and New Hampshire, just kept growing, and nobody was really paying attention to it. Nobody in England, anyway. And once England had a king again, They took New Amsterdam from the Dutch, which, as we mentioned, there wasn't really a fight there. So England really had a pretty solid hold over the east coast of North America, from at least Virginia up to, well, basically Maine. And the Pequot War. This is an illustration in the book of that final battle, attack at Mystic, Connecticut. And they're surrounding the fort and preparing to murder everybody inside, including lots of women and children. I think this is Charles the First, Cromwell. Definitely Cromwell. I've seen this picture a million times. There's Charles II coming back in. Okay, one more war, and then we'll be done. King Philip's War. This was the biggest one, at least for New England. So King Philip's War, which is the English name for the Wampanoag chief Metacom, because apparently, I don't know where the hell they got King Philip. So the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Nipmuc natives fought the English and their allies, the Mohawks, Pequots, Mohawk, whatever, and the Praying Indians, which were the Christian Wampanoags. This was not a small war. This was not a short war. This was not a couple of months of fighting like the Pequot War was. Which, by the way, if you notice, the remaining Pequots are on the side of the English now. 18 New England towns were burned down. Plymouth and Providence were attacked, and Metacom's forces got within 20 miles of Boston. Meanwhile, over a quarter of the population of the natives in the region were wiped out over the course of the war on both sides of the war. The allies of the English and those they were fighting were essentially equally wiped out. It took until Metacom's forces began running low on arms and ammo, and Mohawk forces ambushed and killed Metacom. So the remaining natives fled north to ally with the French because, again, if you don't like the English, work with the French and vice versa. And the Iroquois, who were more or less working with the English, met with colonists in Albany to set up the Covenant Chain to try to focus on peaceful trade as opposed to constant conflict. So yeah, definitely remember King Philip's War and Metacom, because it was rough. There was a lot of things. I mean, everything was, as I said yesterday, everything was made of wood, so there was lots to burn down. But I mean, it was all over the region. It was not some little, the English are going to march in and just burn down a bunch of native villages. It was rough. And this is all I could find for Covenant Chain, so I don't know. Anyway, this should be on Blackboard. North America was still being established by 1631. They couldn't just do like the conquistadors and murder everybody and take stuff. They had to like make settlements and grow things. As far as dealing with the natives, the English kind of took a middle ground. Some of them were as violent as the Spanish, while up in New England and New France, they were, usually doing alliances and trade. There will still be lots of conflict, lots of European-born diseases wiping out tribe, and at the end of the day, the constant expansion would always create conflict with the natives. And all this need for land meant more need for labor, which meant pulling in labor, which is to say slaves, from Africa, which is going to be in greater importance in later chapters. So, with that, we'll do chapter 3 next week.